Hi everybody, welcome to Module 2. In this video, I'm going to provide a brief overview of the ways African Americans' lives were affected by the American Revolution. So throughout this module, we're going to read a series of primary and secondary sources that either come from or focus on the 50 or so years after the Revolution. And this lecture is intended to just give you a little bit more context as you read those documents. And at the end, I'm going to outline three important concepts for understanding slavery in this period. And just a couple administrative details, as always, the readings, assignments, and module questions, they're all in the syllabus. In this case, they're on pages 9 and 10. Okay, let's get into it. So throughout Module 2, we're going to focus on slavery in its so-called middle period from around the time of the American Revolution in the 1770s and 1780s into the 19th century, around roughly 1830. And this was the era when many of the cliches that we associate with American slavery really became synonymous with the institution. I'm talking about its relationship to cotton culture, the auction houses and slave markets of cities such as New Orleans, the grand plantations of the Deep South, and even the idea that slavery was a distinctly, even exclusively, Southern institution. This is the era when slavery solidified connections between the vast and very diverse region stretching from Baltimore, Maryland, all the way down to Texas, when places as different as the cotton plantations around Memphis or New Orleans and the tobacco factories of Richmond came to be economically and politically linked. And of course, the central event in this middle period was the American Revolution. So let's just talk a little bit about slavery in the context of the Revolution. So by the time of the American Revolution, slavery had existed in North America for more than 150 years. All European colonies in North America had slavery in some form, although the relationships with slavery were not all the same. And a helpful distinction that a lot of historians tend to make is some were societies with slaves and some were slave societies. So a society with slave is one in which slavery exists, although it isn't especially common. It isn't foundational to the economy, and it isn't necessarily the basis of the legal or social order. And then, of course, as part of that, there's relatively few enslaved people. And then in a slave society, slavery is the foundation of the entire society. Its economy, its law, etc. Enslavers themselves wield significant influence over the government, and there's a very high population of enslaved people. So at the time of the Revolution, enslaved people made up as much as 40 to 50%, in some cases more than 50% in certain counties, of the populations of colonies such as Virginia and Georgia and South Carolina. So those are slave societies. Another point to keep in mind is that the majority of the founding fathers had at one point in their lives owned slaves, and many owned slaves throughout their lives. So here's an image of George Washington's census of enslaved people on his plantation. This comes from the National Museum of African American History. And another point to keep in mind is that the Revolution profoundly affected the lives of African Americans who experienced it. And it did so in a number of different ways. One was that the Revolution's language of liberty inspired African Americans, both slave and free, to protest their status in the colonies. As one group of African American petitioners in Massachusetts put it, how could America seek release from English tyranny and not seek the same for disadvantaged Africans in her midst? So what you're seeing here is African Americans catching what a number of historians call the contagion of liberty that was spreading through the colonies. The revolution encouraged people to question the status quo. And so African Americans, both slave and free, were doing that. And hoping to advance their cause, roughly 5,000 African Americans supported the revolutionary military effort. Rhode Island and Connecticut created all-black military units. Rhode Island even enlisted roughly 250 enslaved people with the promise of emancipation after the war. So that's one side of the story. And another side of the story is quite different, right? Other colonies, particularly those that were more dependent on slavery, those that were slave societies, such as South Carolina and Georgia, they were less eager to arm enslaved soldiers. And slave-owning elites in those states believed that arming several thousand enslaved people would threaten the entire slave labor system. They were probably not wrong about that. And so with their support unwelcomed by many Americans, several thousand enslaved people actually joined the British Army, which guaranteed their freedom if they abandoned their masters. Here's Thomas Jefferson. And in an ironic twist, 30 of Thomas Jefferson's slaves, Jefferson was the author of the Declaration of Independence, 30 of his slaves ran away to join the British. The British decision to welcome escaping slaves actually might have hurt their overall effort, as loyalist whites from Virginia to Georgia became infuriated, and came to see supporting the American side as a way to preserve their property in slaves. Right, so these are people who otherwise were very suspicious of independence. They did not believe in the sort of cause of the revolution, but decided to support the colonies in their rebellion as a way to protect slavery. So at the end of the war, about 15,000 African Americans left the U.S. with the British. So there are two great transformations or consequences of this middle period that I would like you to consider as we work through this module. And to some extent, these transformations are kind of incongruous. There's a bit of a paradox between the two that it's worth your time to think a bit about how it could be that both of these things occurred in this 50-year period. So the first great transformation was the initiation of slavery's demise in the societies with slaves of the North. And this was a long process, and it varied from state to state. But in general, between 1877 and 1804, every state north of Maryland took steps to abolish slavery. In some cases, abolition was swift. Vermont became the first region in the Americas to abolish slavery in 1777. The Supreme Court of Massachusetts found slavery unconstitutional and ended it in 1783. Other states chose not to end slavery outright, but to initiate a process called gradual emancipation. In general, that meant living enslaved people would not be freed, but their future children, so children they had after these laws were passed, would achieve freedom at a certain age. Sometimes that was 18 or 21 or 28. And because of this drawn out process of emancipation, there were still enslaved people in northern states through much of the 19th century. In Connecticut until the 1840s, when that state's final enslaved people were emancipated, and actually as late as 1860 in New Jersey. This is the year of Abraham Lincoln's election, just the same year that South Carolina seceded from the Union and initiated what became the Civil War. There were still some enslaved people in New Jersey. So the big picture is that the abolition of Northern slavery, whether it was swift or gradual, it really required no immediate economic sacrifice. So some historians have called this philanthropy at bargain prices. And that's because these were, as I said before, societies with slaves. Slavery wasn't so deeply tied to these regions' economies that it would significantly affect life there if slavery were to be abolished. And another really important point to make is that emancipation did not mean that formerly enslaved people had become equal members of the American political community. In fact, one of the consequences of abolition and emancipation was more overt and widespread prejudice and segregation of free African Americans. So the historian Winthrop Jordan has said that after the Revolutionary War came a trend which included tighter restrictions upon slaves, and especially free African Americans, the separation of the races at places of social gathering, and the founding of exclusively African American churches. In addition to segregation and prejudice, free African Americans faced poverty and tended to work in the most menial positions in the northern economy. They were boot blacks, waiters, chimney sweeps, grave diggers, clothes washers. And just as enslaved African Americans had adopted that language of the revolution, that language of liberty, the contagion of liberty, to demand their freedom during the war, free African Americans after the war responded to this growing sense of segregation and prejudice by demanding liberty and equality. So this is a petition written by a group of free African Americans in Massachusetts, one of whom was the very famous sailor Paul Cuffey. And what they're arguing in this petition is that the state's tax system is very unfair. It's unduly burdensome for African Americans, in part because as the children of enslaved people, African Americans lack access to a really critical source of wealth, which is inheritance. And yet they're being taxed at the same rates as people who enjoyed the right of inheritance. So in the first decade or so after the Revolutionary War, during the 1780s and 1790s, this kind of general trend, this general move away from slavery that we see in the North, actually even seemed possible in the slave societies, or at least some of the slave societies of the South as well. The U.S. Constitution included a compromise provision that Congress would outlaw the transatlantic slave trade, meaning the supply of enslaved people from Africa would be cut off in 1808, 20 years after ratification. To be clear, after that, that did happen, and then after that, an illegal transatlantic slave trade emerged, although that would pale in comparison to the domestic slave trade that I'm going to talk about in just a little bit here. And in Virginia, declining revenues for tobacco planters and other slaveholders led many to question the further need for enslaved laborers. And then one other thing that concerned American slaveholders was another revolution. And this one occurred in the French Caribbean, in the colony of Saint-Domingue. And this was what came to be known as the Haitian Revolution. And it was a successful revolution of enslaved people, and they ended up forming an independent nation called Haiti. So Southern slaveholders, in the wake of the Haitian Revolution, they're thinking back, they're remembering the thousands of enslaved people who had joined the British during the Revolution, And they start thinking differently about this very large enslaved population that's in their midst. And they start thinking of them as an enemy within. This was a common term that was used at the time. That is, there's potential rebels in our fields, in our kitchens, even in our bedrooms. They're so deeply embedded in our society that it makes us insecure. In response to all of these concerns, right, the fear of the enemy within, the growing sense that slavery was unnecessary for the economy, um, and the kind of constitutional provisions that might limit slavery in the future, quite a few Virginia planters manumitted or freed their enslaved population. And that process, along with emancipation in abolition in the North, meant that the free black population was rising steadily throughout the post-revolutionary years. And this is one of the important consequences of this era. So a number of observers are trying to weigh in on what to do about this. This is something different in American history. A large and growing population of free African Americans, and it makes a number of white observers concerned. One of them is Thomas Jefferson. He concludes that free African Americans really can't remain in the United States. He does not believe in a sort of interracial democracy. And so he and a number of other really influential intellectuals in the period advocate for a scheme called colonization, right? They want to send former enslaved people to Africa, even though the vast majority of them had never been to Africa. Many of them, their parents had never been to Africa, right? They'd all been born in North America. And as you think about that fear, and you think about these sort of intellectual justification for colonization, I encourage you to think back to the Edmund Morgan article we've just read. Think about his argument about why white elites distinguished between enslaved African Americans and free white laborers in the colonial period. Why would they do that? And then how did that division ensure the elites' hold on power? Right, another way of thinking about that exact same issue would, and that the elites themselves might have offered instead, would be, how did that division between poor free white labor and enslaved African American labor preserve the social status quo? How did that maintain society as it had been known? Okay, so to sum up transformation number one, we've got the abolition of slavery in some states, we've got gradual emancipation in others, and we've got a rising population of free African Americans throughout the North and in some southern regions, in particular in Virginia. Okay, so the second transformation that I wanted to talk about takes off a little later. It really accelerates around the turn of the 19th century, around the year 1800. And this is the rapid expansion of slavery in the South and the West. And just remember, at the beginning of this, I talked about how these two transformations aren't necessarily congruent, right? There's a bit of a paradox between the two. So if the first is the decline of slavery in some parts of the new United States, here we have its rapid expansion in others. One way to think about this is between 1676 and 1776, obviously this is the year of the Declaration of Independence, the year of American independence. So in that 100 years, the slave population in mainland North America grew to about 500,000 people. And then between 1776 and 1820, less than 50 years, it grew to 1.5 million. And then again, in the 40 years after 1820, that would lead up to the American Civil War, that population would grow to 4 million. And one of the reasons for this was that the American Revolution had opened the western frontier beyond the Appalachian Mountains to settlement. And that national geographic expansion also meant the expansion of slave territory. So 6 new slave states joined the Union between the 1790s and 1820. It's Kentucky and Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and then finally, and most controversially, Missouri. Missouri enters the Union in 1820 as part of the famous Compromise of 1820, the Missouri Compromise, under which Maine also entered the Union as a free state to balance Missouri in the Senate. But also, Congress declared that slavery would not be permitted. No new slave states would be permitted above the 3630 parallel. In other words, slavery would be truly Southern. There were slave states above the 3630 parallel. Missouri's one of them. Kentucky, Virginia, and Maryland, those are others. But there would be no more. And we're going to come back to that in Module 3 when Congress decided to potentially challenge that old rule in the 1850s. Okay, so the most important engine of slavery's expansion was the emergence of short staple cotton culture, and that is the widespread cultivation of this crop that would go on to fuel the Industrial Revolution. Here's one way to think about the growth of cotton culture in America. So in 1790, the United States produced 3,000 bales of cotton. In 1840, it produced 1,350,000. And that change was made possible by a few different factors. One was that expansion of settlement west that I was just talking about. The American government really opens up Western lands through a series of policies. Most significant was the removal of native people from these lands. And by Western here, I'm talking about a place that we would not consider the West anymore. Places like Tennessee, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. Another factor that led to the expansion of cotton culture was the invention in 1793 of the cotton gin. And the cotton gin was important because it combed these sticky seeds out of short staple cotton. If you did this by hand, it's very painful and it takes a really long time. It's not efficient work. And the cotton gin makes that work much more efficient. It basically eliminates one of the most arduous tasks of short staple cotton agriculture. And it separates the seeds from this really valuable fiber. And then the last thing that makes the expansion of cotton culture possible was the persistence of slavery in the South. Right? This enabled white planters to easily move workers out to this new western frontier from, say, South Carolina or Georgia out to Alabama or Mississippi or Louisiana, and coerce labor from those workers at a very brutal, very breakneck pace. Right? If they were relying on free labor, they would have to find ways to coerce a huge number of people to move to this very punishing, very uncomfortable frontier region. But they didn't have to convince anybody. They could force workers into the area, and they did. So in the wake of the cotton gin, slavery in the U.S. was profoundly transformed. Remember, as I just mentioned a couple of minutes ago, in the 1780s and even in the 1790s, Virginia enslavers, they're flirting with the idea of actually ending slavery. They're increasingly uncomfortable with slavery's persistence. They don't necessarily see a future for slavery in the United States. Now suddenly, at the end of this middle period, enslaved African Americans are producing 75% of the world's cotton supply, and they're fueling the Industrial Revolution of the northern United States and Europe. So this is one of these sort of paradoxes of the middle period. Although slavery had seemed to be in national decline in the 1780s, By the early 19th century, it was reborn. It covered more territory than it had before. Many more enslaved people um, lived in the United States than ever. And the leaders of this ascendant slave society in the South were incredibly powerful, and they were self-conscious of their shared interests. So let's just quickly review this middle period and a few of the major changes. First, increasingly, the United States is increasingly divided between a slave South and a free North. And there's a number of causes for this. There's the increasing abolition of slavery in the North, the increasing importance of slavery in the South, and there's this law, this 3630 parallel, that kind of contains slavery in the southern United States. I will say it's a little easy to overstate that division, the North-South division. Um, so just keep in mind the two sections, they really were economically dependent on one another. And that's most obviously because of cotton, right? Enslavers aren't just making cotton and sitting on it, right? They're shipping it out of the South, and to a significant extent, they're shipping it to the North to feed these growing mills of industrial cities, most famously places like Lowell and Lawrence, Massachusetts. The second big takeaway from this period is that cotton really had become the central economic engine of Southern life and also national economic life. So by 1803, it was the nation's leading export, and it would remain that through the Civil War. Another big change from the period is that the transatlantic slave trade was outlawed. As I said earlier, this is in 1808. It was sort of grandfathered out um, by the Constitution. But in its place emerged the active, very lucrative domestic slave trade. And one way that scholars have thought about this domestic slave trade is as the second Middle Passage. So the first Middle Passage we talked about in Module 1, it's the journey from Africa to the Americas. The second Middle Passage is the journey from the Upper South. When I say that, I mean places like Virginia and Maryland to the Lower South, places like Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, the Cotton Kingdom. Okay, and many of these enslaved people, they are being sold through the markets of cities like New Orleans. Fourth big takeaway for the middle period is this, and this is something we're going to focus on a lot in Module 3, but just keep it in mind for now, this pervasive revolutionary language of emancipation and liberty. Enslaved people throughout the Americas, not just in the United States, had taken note of the ideological significance of the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Haitian Revolution. All of these occurred within about 20 years at the end of the 18th century. So although enslaved people had always found ways to challenge their bondage, this age of revolution provided both an ideological argument against slavery and a roadmap for achieving freedom. And then finally, just to sum up, what we have, the major takeaway here from this period is a new centrality of slavery to American politics and society and economy and culture. Great Britain would abolish slavery in its colonies in 1833. So at that point, and that's right around the end of this middle period, at that point the United States became the center of global slavery. And what it would grow to become in the decades that followed that, in the so-called antebellum period, the 30-ish years before the American Civil War, to become the largest slave society in the history of the world. So this whole state of affairs, just one more time to bring up, it might seem kind of ironic or bizarre. On the one hand, 50 years following the American Revolution, we have a demise or the promise of demise of slavery in much of the United States and actually in much of the Americas. And we have a legal ban on the transatlantic slave trade. But then on the other hand, we have slavery growing in both numbers of enslaved people and the geographic region it covered through the American South. So, despite the general decline of governments prohibiting slavery in the Americas, the number of slaves in the U.S. tripled in the 50 years following the American Revolution, and the number of slaves in the Western Hemisphere actually doubled. Okay, and now just to finish up, I want to review three important concepts that will be really valuable for you as you work through the readings throughout this module. So the first one is commodification. And this is the central concern of Dana Ramey Berry's book, The Price for Their Pound of Flesh, that we're going to read in this module. And what commodification means is it's the process by which a person was turned into a commodity, right? The process by which a human being was given a price. It's the process by which that chattel principle we talked about in Module 1 was made real. And commodification was always part of the transatlantic slave trade, but we're going to spend more time focusing on it in this module and thinking about the mechanisms by which enslavers assigned a price for their human property. And then we're going to think about how those prices may be changed throughout a person's life cycle or in response to certain events in a person's life. And we're going to think about how the commodification of enslaved people, just as much as the booming cotton culture, really shaped the Southern economy. The sale of enslaved people occurred in a web of complex economic interactions that relied on a lot more people than just the slave owner. You had slave traders who relied on bank loans to purchase slave property that then they would sell, hopefully, in their case, hoping to earn a profit. You had insurance companies that would insure the lives of enslaved people for their owners. You had this really extensive route of migration from the upper south to the lower south for this second middle passage. And along that route, you have storekeepers, doctors, and small farmers, all of them supplying slave traders and profiting from the movement of enslaved property across the country. And you even have, newspapers publishing ads, deriving ad revenue from the sale of enslaved people. So the next term to keep in mind is paternalism. So planters, enslavers, were deeply tied to the global market in cotton. And this was, at this point, the most advanced economy that had ever existed in the world. The fortunes of slave owners in the South were deeply dependent on the needs of cotton industrialists in Liverpool and London and up in Massachusetts and New Hampshire and New York. But enslavers tended not to portray themselves as competitive capitalists, right? And instead they chose this image as like lords, as gentlemen who were responsible for taking care of their family, which extended to include their enslaved property. And this outlook was known as paternalism. It's how enslavers justified slavery and how they masked or hid the brutal realities of slavery. This is what the historian Eugene Genovese, who is responsible for much of how we think about paternalism. This is what he wrote about it back in the 1960s. For the slaveholders, paternalism represented an attempt to overcome the fundamental contradiction in slavery, the impossibility of the slaves ever becoming the things they were supposed to be. Right? By that, Genovese means free individuals who have a say in their own lives. And Genovese continues, paternalism defined the involuntary labor of the slaves as a legitimate return to their masters for protection and direction. Right? In other words, the masters were essentially doing enslaved people a favor and protecting them. I will say this idea, this rendering of slavery as a paternalistic institution still exists. I have encountered it in contemporary sort of political discourse in the last couple of years. It's still floating around out there. So as we move through this module, I want to think very critically about the history of this idea, how it developed, and how enslaved people themselves actually thought about it. Right? If paternalism was legitimate, then we would need enslaved people themselves to say that it was legitimate. So we're going to see how they responded throughout this module. And then the last term, the last concept to think about is resistance. So for the next few weeks, we're going to be thinking a lot about how enslaved people resisted their status. And there's a few different ways this could happen. In some cases, it could be very overt. It could take the form of an open rebellion. So we're going to read about Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. This is the largest slave revolt in U.S. history, besides the last one that occurred during the Civil War. And we're going to read deeply about Nat Turner's rebellion, how Nat Turner himself understood his role, as well as how slave owners throughout the South responded in the wake of this rebellion. And other kind of overt acts of resistance could include more individual acts of violence, arson, poisoning, assault. Here's one famous example of this. In his first autobiography, Frederick Douglass, who's the far and away the most famous African American of the 19th century, one of the most important American intellectuals in the 19th century, who was born into slavery in Maryland and escaped around the age of 20 and became an incredibly prolific author, an incredibly prolific commentator on the politics of his day, and one of the most powerful voices for abolition. So he, in his first autobiography, he described this sense of liberation he felt after beating a so-called slave breaker named Edward Covey. He wrote, "Mr. Covey seemed now to think he had me and could do what he pleased. But at this moment, from whence came the spirit I don't know, I resolved to fight, and I seized Covey hard by the throat." And Douglass goes on to describe beating this guy for a couple of hours. It's very exhausting. And recognizing that Covey, whose economic livelihood depends on his ability to essentially tame enslaved people, to make them submissive, Covey can never really speak publicly about what happened, or else his livelihood would be ruined. Douglass is able to take advantage of that and beat this guy and actually make Covey submissive to him. It's a fascinating passage in that book. So most commonly, resistance was not overt and it wasn't violent. Instead, it was more subtle. It was woven into everyday life. It could take the form of songs that communicated messages. Keep that one in mind. We're going to think about that in this module a lot. It could be intentionally sabotaging work. It could be thwarting their sale somehow by, in the midst of an auction, right? An enslaved person could speak up and say that they felt ill, or they could say that they were much older than the slave trader was reporting. Things like that that would make people less likely to buy them. It could be controlling the pace of work. It could be like Frederick Douglass did when he was a teenager, um, teaching oneself how to read, right? And Douglass was able to do that because he was, by that point in his life, he was in Baltimore. Right? He was still enslaved and he was living in Baltimore, and being in the city provided opportunities that being in the countryside would not have. But it was still an important act of resistance. A useful metaphor for this resistance comes from the historian Ira Berlin. He wrote, "The essence of the slave's history can be found in the ever-changing music to which slaves were forced to dance, and in their ability to superimpose their own rhythms by ever so slight changes of cadence, accent, and beat." Right? In other words, although enslaved people were utterly dominated, this is the most extreme form of human exploitation, they could work within the system, at least to some extent, to achieve some of their own goals. That is, the enslaver's domination was never complete. The relationship between enslavers and the enslaved was unequal in the extreme, but it was still a relationship. It was one that was constantly under negotiation. It was a continuous dialectic. Right? And this is Ira Berlin, the historian Ira Berlin. Again, he wrote, "While slave owners held most of the good cards in this meanest of all contests, slaves held cards of their own. And even when their cards were reduced to near worthlessness, slaves still held the last card, which, as their owners well understood, they might play at any time." Think about Nat Turner when I read that. I think about Frederick Douglass, and I also think about Harriet Jacobs, who had escaped her enslavement in North Carolina, and she put it like this in her narrative: "My master had power and law on his side. I had a determined will." Okay, I'm excited to talk about all of this with you this week, and for the next couple of weeks. Let me know if you have any questions.